This is Krista Messina coming at you from the Messy Time Studios, broadcasting as ever from the beaches of the last free state in America, Florida, which my current guest may have some exceptions to that characterization. But I welcome into the studios from Maine, Amos Eno, who has deep experience in the federal government and in natural resources. And I will just stop there and over to you. Perhaps you could give us a bit of color on your background and what we were just discussing a second ago.
Well, so you're in Florida?
Yes.
All right. Well, so my first job after college was working for the Secretary of the Interior, the Assistant Secretary of the Interior, Nathaniel Reed, who is one of the icons of the environmental movement, and came to Washington after Wally Hickle's dismissal by Nixon and served as Assistant Secretary, so overseeing the conservation side. So I was in the office that wrote the Endangered Species Act in 1973 and implemented, dozens of conservation initiative, all the Alaska lands. It was called the D2 planning effort, increasing land acquisition, modernizing both the Park Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service. After that, I did a quick and dirty master's at Cornell, went around the world for a year looking at hitchhiked from Nairobi to Cape Town, went around across the Asia and South America. And then I worked in the Office of Endangered Species in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for 5 years. And then I went to Audubon and was the director of wildlife programs at Audubon. And it was during my Audubon years, I started focusing on budget issues, particularly in natural resources, and lobbying the appropriations committees, which basically the environmental movement ignores. And I helped create the National Wildlife Forensics Lab for the Fish and Wildlife Service in Oregon, the National Leadership Training Center. And then in 1986, I went to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And that was, coincident with the Reagan administration, David Stockman, and the early efforts in the Reagan years to basically eviscerate conservation environmental programs. And we started something that I euphemistically called the needs assessment. And every year, by end of March, produce these 1,000-page documents, equivalent to your tome, that analyze the budgets of the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, Natural Resource Conservation Service, and USDA.
Can I interrupt you briefly to ask, what was your perception of how much of that very thorough work that was done was actually read by the intended audience? Like, did people really dive into it? Did they read the summaries? How much impact do you think it had? I'm always kind of curious about the relationship between kind of work product of intelligent staffers and what actually happens inside Leviathan.
Well, that's a good question. Appropriations is a total inside ball game.
Yeah.
And it's really based on the relationship you build with the appropriation staffers. During those years, Sid Yates was from Illinois, Democrat, was the chairman of the House. Stevens from Alaska was a chairman on the Senate side, with McClure from Idaho. So you had conservative Republicans. And so I had to walk both sides of the aisle. And I undertook this project with the understanding from Yates' staff, who at the time was Neil Sigmund, that this would be helpful. They would welcome it. And, probably of the intended audience, on the House side, maybe 20 people. On the Senate side, maybe 10 or 15. But it was impactful. And as I said, by 1990, natural resources budgets were at the highest levels in history.
So it actually had an impact. So 20 congressional staffers and 15 Senate staffers. That means 35 more people on the Hill read your work than mine. Okay. Excellent.
But again, and then this is one of the things the environmental movement has always basically ignored the appropriations process, except for testifying for more land acquisition money, which is, shoveling money to the Nature Conservancy or the Conservation Fund, etc. Because it takes a ton of work to analyze those budgets and basically make change recommendations. And the bottom line is you can't take credit for it. The decisions are made by the members of Congress and the Senate, and you can't run your press release and say, I at National Audubon or whatnot, we did this, because that completely undermine your credibility. So it's a total inside ball game in terms of how you work the process. I mean, for example, right now I have the former clerk of the Senate Appropriations Committee on my board. And I've been trying to work on half of my current nonprofit is called Land Conservation Assistance Network. It's the largest conservation information platform on the internet targeting private landowners. Why? 71% of the United States today is privately owned, and nobody's talking to that market. 80% of endangered species habitat is on private land. You can't recover endangered species today without working with private landowners. And yet the entire
crazy patchwork of either redundant, overlapping, occasionally contradictory state, federal, local laws that it would take a private landowner, months of study to figure out, what do I qualify for? Oh, if I add 8 feet more of hedgerow, I get 18% more of my taxes. Like there's a lot of well-intentioned stuff, but because it's written in legalese and bureaucratic jargon, they may not even know it exists. Is that a fair assessment?
Average person doesn't have a clue. I mean, first of all, you have all these alphabetized agencies. The bureaucracy and even the grant programs are so complex. I started actually this summer publishing on Substack, and my most recent published article was on USDA, the Natural Resource Conservation Service. It's got like 15 grant programs. But
that's how I found you on Substack. I've been writing, and I was like, this is brilliant. This is the kind of analysis that I love in each department, because someone's got to bring some clarity to the mess, because the average American is too busy raising their families, going to Little League and watching football on the weekends. They can't dive into all this, but yet our tax dollars are paying for it.
So you also made a key point on the lack of coordination. I mean, today in 2024, all the federal agencies are siloed. They don't talk to each other. They don't work together. One of the reasons I was fired from National Fish and Wildlife by Bruce Babbitt was I was getting appropriations from 13 different agencies and forcing them to work together. We did a program for 3 years on Pacific salmon that pooled money from U.S. Fish and Wildlife, NOAA, NIMS, BLM, Forest Service, Bonneville Power, Army Corps, and one of Babbitt's solicitors. And the grant program was successful for 3 years, $90 million.
Break in really quickly to say, I want to continue, but like most people have never looked at a system like that. And if you haven't looked at the fact that Pacific salmon via, bear poop and fish migration upriver, normal people would say, well, why is the Forestry Service involved? What does this got to do with anything? Well,
they own
in the
all
Pacific
the
Northwest, yeah, that's where all the nutrients for the forest growth comes from, is Pacific salmon, which is counterintuitive if you're just thinking of, well, yeah, I mean, I get it, they're in the ocean, I understand somehow they go up a river, but it's that sort of complexity is why I would imagine this is so hard to convey to overwhelmed congressional staffers who've got a billion things to deal with, never mind trying to date the intern in the office next door. Anyway, sorry, go on.
Well, anyway, for example, the highest tributary in the Snake River, which flows into the Columbia, but the highest tributary for spawning salmon is on the Lemhi River in eastern Idaho at between over 6,000 feet. And it's all Forest Service and BLM land at the headquarters. And this doesn't happen anymore today. One of the key things that I've been
Very, very quickly for my younger listeners, BLM is the Bureau of Land Management in this instance,
correct.
not Black Lives Matter. Go
Correct.
ahead.
And they own in Oregon what are called the O&C lands. It's the old railroad checkerboard lands,
Mhm.
but few people know that. But they're one of the largest forest managers in Oregon, and
Sure.
so many of the salmon rivers, like the Rogue and whatnot, are BLM headwaters. But in USDA today, well,
So,
so anyway,
to use I derailed you, but Babbitt can you because you were doing coordination between multiple agencies? Is that part of what you were saying, that he couldn't stand that idea that you went outside the silos?
right, and I've been preaching that not very successfully for the last 2 decades. I mean, LandCAN, my nonprofit today, is the only nonprofit. We host all the federal agencies that touch private landowners. Most of the programs are USDA. There's a program I created during my NFWF years, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation years, at the Fish and Wildlife Service called Partners for Wildlife. It's about a $50 million program. It's Interior's only program of reaching out to landowners. We host all the comparable programs at the state level. We host all the nonprofits that don't do advocacy. We don't host any of the litigation advocacy groups, but every land trust in the country, every conservation district. But the most important database we host is 57,000 for-profit businesses working in rural America. For example, we host like 6,000 tax and estate lawyers. Why? Because the average age of farmers is 60. The average age of forest owners is over 70. They all should be in tax and estate planning. We host 6,000 consulting foresters. There are 12 million landowners in the United States. 10 million are forest owners. It's 4/5 of the landowning market. And, one of the problems at USDA is they won't fund technical service providers, which are the consultants that help people apply for their bloody grants. And even though the
Just
farm
for best practices, it kills me because having worked with a lot of responsible forestry managers, right? We go on vacation a lot, northeast, southeast, up to the Adirondacks, and it will drive me insane. I will be on private land hiking or fishing or whatever, and the degree to which forestry management, which used to be a kind of a core American skill 100 years ago, is gone. You see
it's
horribly
totally gone.
mismanaged, overgrown. It's terrible.
Well, you read the headlines. I mean, you've got 15 million acres of U.S. Forest Service lands in California. 12 million have been burned. You've got 7 million acres in Oregon and Northern California burning this year. So this goes back to the spotted owl listing, which put 80,000 people out of work. It was based on flawed science. And then Clinton's Northwest Forest Plan. And so you read the LA Times today, the New York Times, it's global warming, which is complete horseshit. What we have is 50 years of understory growth caused by environmental. Well, if you look at the papers today, every week, environmentalists are suing to prevent forest management. You've had 5 mills shut down.
Forest fires.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a man-made problem caused by the environmental community and bureaucrats that can't find their way to the bathroom, basically.
Yep.
And it's
And the fact that you say that so clearly, and coming from someone who's been in the space this long, to have been there long enough before this idiocy began. But I'd be out in Northern California. I remember this, it was hiking up, up north of Marin County. Years ago, I worked in Silicon Valley, and it was dry as hell. The tinder stacked up. I was like, we could die here if someone lit a cigarette in the next valley and dropped it. Like the fire would get to me so fast. There's no way I can get out of here in this lovely, idyllic, dry landscape overlooking the Pacific Ocean. And they're living in a fool's paradise. And then every time it happens, and $609 million homes go up in smoke, they start bitching and moaning and crying climate change.
Well, yeah, and people are dying. Insurance companies are vacating the state. I did for EarthX TV, at some point, you can look up, or I can send you the links. American Forest
Put them
Fires.
in the link here. Yeah.
Okay, I did it. It's a 4-part series, 45-minute series that walks through the entire history. I mean, what the American public doesn't understand, from Maine to California, all the Amerindians burned our forests. That's how they created food. That's where the deer, elk, buffalo, etc. came from for 5,000 years. So we have fire-adapted ecosystems. Today, the largest declining suite of birds are grassland birds. And in the East, I mean, the East is almost totally forested today, even populated states like New Jersey and Connecticut. And there's no forest management. In New Jersey today, in the pine lands, even on private land, you have to get like 10 permits to cut a tree. And you have a massive fire at 10,000 acres in New Jersey between New York and Philadelphia, you're going to have hell to pay. But this is a real problem.
Even down into like the core suburbs of Manhattan. Friends of mine living in Mahwah, and I point this one particular municipality out because it was completely insane. They were building a new house in a suburb. It wasn't like they were clearing a farm. They knocked down an old house, were building a new one, and while they were doing it, they had to remove like a maple tree, like 2 or 3 insanely common species, and that were only like 10 or 15 years old. And they went through this year-long process arguing with the county, the city, and the state, because part of their plan was they were putting in 40 new trees of 30 different species. So they were adding to species diversification. They're clearing out old deadwood, but it cost them God knows how many tens of thousands of dollars to fight with an unaccountable bureaucrat about trees on their land. Absolutely insanity.
It is insanity. And people in contemporary society, first of all, we don't know our history. Again, if you go back to California, California's got a Mediterranean climate, so it dries out all the time. If you look back, what happened to the Spanish missions in the 1600s? They all shut down, right? They had a 30-year drought in the 1600s. They starved to death, and the Indians, and that's historical record.
And Steinbeck uses those periods of drought in California in multiple of his novels about this, Salinas Valley and the rest of it. They arrive in this wonderful place that's rain and abundant, and the agriculture is fabulous, and then in 10 years it's a drought, and it goes on forever. I mean, it's people should read more Steinbeck is what you should take away from this show.
Correct. So anyway, it's today. I mean, everything is problematic, and we've gone through basically 20 years without any progress on the federal budget in addressing these issues, from forest management to endangered species. I mean, the Fish and Wildlife Service today not only cannot recover species, they're actually an impediment for the same sort of bureaucratic things you just described. I mean, the emphasis of, particularly in Democratic administrations, has been on regulation rather than recovering species, and environmentalists using species to shut down forest management, shut down oil and gas, shut down this development, that development.
My favorite during the Obama administration was the EPA going after coal companies in the Midwest because mallards were found floating in waste ponds, right? The same mallards that hunters shoot by the millions every year. And the fact is, statistically, birds die. And statistically, 12 birds in flight died and fell into a coal waste pond.
Well,
and they sued the industry.
They did the same thing with oil and gas companies on the oil and water basins next to drill sites.
Yeah.
Simultaneously, though, they stopped enforcing the Migratory Bird Act and the Endangered Species Act on mortalities caused by wind and solar. You've had 20 years.
That's good for America.
Yeah. And the windmills are slicing and dicing eagles, hawks,
condors,
thousands, and they're not enforcing that.
species that are killed in the massive land cover by solar panels, who are baking to death in that heat, who are being deprived of water sources. It's magic. I did a whole series on the show about the offshore windmills that are providing electricity at 6 times the cost, while killing whales, destroying fisheries. Not, you can't navigate around these things. Never mind from a national security perspective, they blind our over the horizon radar to missiles that could be coming from our old friends in Russia. Right? I am partisan. I don't pretend not to be, but it's mainly because they give me so much ammo. I always say about most Democrat administrations that if they chose policies at random, statistically, half of what they did would be right. It takes genius to be wrong 100% of the time.
They're genius. I mean, here in Maine, they've been trying to shut down the lobster industry because of right whale mortality and humpbacks. And NMFS, National Marine Fisheries Service, just issued a permit allowing wind developers to kill 30 white whales a year.
Yep.
The whole population is only 240 whales.
Right.
So again, you
need really expensive offshore electricity. And one of my favorite things about the hypocrisy of some politicians, if not all, was when a study was done, I think 25, 30 years ago, about where, if you're going to place offshore windmills anywhere in the United States, you're looking for, obviously, where's the wind most constant, where does it blow the hardest, where would you get the most electricity? Turned out that would be right off Kennebunkport, Maine. And the Kennedys said, oh, no. I can't have my lovely ocean views obscured. Thank you. Put those windmills somewhere else where poor people see the ocean. It kills me.
A lot of this stuff is just twisted into a pretzel hold right now. And
so what are your thoughts? Like the nonprofit you're running now, clearly with a lot of experience, you are good at trying to focus on not only what is theoretically right, but what can be practically done, right? So I assume your foundation helps people really move towards things that are useful. How are you finding that?
We rebranded and changed our name from originally in 2000 when I set up my nonprofit. It was the Private Landowner Network. We rebranded in 2016 to Land Conservation Assistance Network. Since then, user traffic has grown by 20 to 55% every year. This year, we're going to have 1 million users. I mean, there are only 1.9 million farms and ranches in the United States. So that's market penetration. My focus has always been, how do you solve problems? And again, for land conservation, species conservation, private landowners are the solution, not federal government lands. And federal government lands or public lands are so mismanaged today, as forest fires are an exemplar, that they're not going to accomplish anything. And private landowners
dollars prosecuting people out west for potential violations of cattle grazing.
Yeah, well, I mean, cattle grazing, again, you have to look at these things from historical purposes. I mean, again, my great uncle was Gifford Pinchot, who founded the Forest Service with Teddy Roosevelt. And why did they do that? Well, they did that because in the 1880s and 90s, I mean, they decimated the forests in New England, then the forests of the Midwest, and they're moving west. And so they created federal forests and a very professional organization. But today, private companies like Red Emerson's Sierra Pacific or Collins Pine, I mean, they're 100 times better forest managers than the federal government. Here in Maine, I mean, 89% of Maine is forested. It's all private land. And companies like Seven Islands are doing a fantastic job, not only on forestry, but also on species management, far superior than the federal government. And the same thing is ranchers. I mean, again, in the 20s, 30s, in the Dust Bowl and stuff, ranchers overgrazed. And that's why you had a lot of the agriculture programs created. But today, ranchers are by far better managers than the federal government. You have both hunters are going to ranches. Look what people like the Turners have done for bringing back buffalo. And ranchers and farmers, they're on their land 7 days a week. They're not 3 or 4 days a week bureaucrats who sort of just let things go with nature. And that's going to be the 21st conservation market. And it's not going to bust the budget. I mean, federal budget, you've got 3 problems with federal funding for conservation. One, the initial cost of buying land at open market prices. Secondly, they don't manage it. And so that creates huge expenses. And then when you finally fix it, like replanting trees in California and stuff, you've got all the rehabilitation costs. So you've got 3 layers of misallocation of funding.
One of my main contention in the book I wrote and the approach I take to how we should think about our fiscal responsibilities communally is a dollar not, if you can not spend the dollar, that's always better than spending the dollar. If there's a private sector solution that works, great. Right.
Well, you have, I mean, again, for example, I've invested recently in a company called Tanzel, which is an AI company with robotic sensors. They've got over 1,000 sensors. Last year, they prevented 1,000 forest fires in California. It's called Cal Alert. And basically, it accumulates all the information from these sensors and alerts the agencies. Obviously, it's not 100% effective yet, but again, this is a private company that's basically replicating what Pinchot did 100 years ago of creating forest towers on the top of every mountain. You now have sensors that go immediately to an information platform that alerts the agencies at both the federal and state level. Private sector, again, it's going to be the solution. I mean, we're dealing with, what is it, an $18 trillion deficit? Our daily payments on debt servicing is $3 billion a day, more than the defense budget.
I'm with four from the folks who look at this in holistically, where my number is the lowest, where we are cumulatively taking into account state, federal, local, and unfunded promises made to people by the government. I'm at about 185 trillion. And someone else I respect highly is closer to $240 trillion. It is, and most Americans, part of why I run it my Substack, part of why I do this podcast, part of why I wrote the book. I got better things. Well, no, I don't have better things to do with my life. I've got other things to do with my life that would pay me to do. But most folks, as I try to tell them, the professional political class, which the founders never wanted to exist, have insulated themselves by doing 2 things. They have made the operations of the government both simultaneously wildly boring and insanely complex, right? So both are barriers to getting any understanding of what they're up to, which is how they like it. Just fine, thank you very much, right? The from the financial markets where I come from, 30 years of the global capital markets, the original Glass-Steagall Act, around the SEC creation and separation of commercial and investment banking in the 20s, that was, I think, 4 pages long. Dodd-Frank was something like 4,000 pages long and was stupid, right? So everyone should, part of what I demand in the book is that you should demand to your congresspeople, in the age of the internet, there is no excuse. I remember Barack Obama, when he was running for office, promised a transparent government, right? Right now, you could have the text of a bill online today, right? Every congressman and just a government website. Here's a pending bill. Here it is, 5 pages. Here's what it says, and have a 2-week comment period before Congress.
What did Nancy Pelosi say about reading it?
Yeah, you're not going to read it. No, you got to pass it to see what's in it, right? So, what exactly, because I've got the book out and I've been out speaking, right? And people ask me constantly, well, you've been working on this for a while. I've done a lot in DC, so I know the beast from a private sector side. You know it more intimately from both sides of the thing. So the only answer I have is unfortunately what the founders wanted. You have to pay attention. Each of you individually. I can't do it. I can't change it. That's what dictators do. Here's my suggestion. I urge you to get involved. And we'll see. Either they're going to or
Well,
they're not
we
going
need
to.
to go back to passing appropriations bills. I mean, look what Johnson lost again yesterday with 14 Republicans uh,
Yep.
preventing it. But we haven't passed annual appropriations bills for decades.
It's insanity.
It's
It's absolute
completely
insanity.
dysfunctional.
Completely dysfunctional.
Yeah.
So, what would be your main? So I found out that the key attention metric of my beautiful, wonderful listeners is around half an hour. What would you say is like kind of the most important thing from what you've seen in all your experience around there's no one left or right that hates the environment, right? There's no one sitting around saying, "God, I wish that river were polluted," right? What what is your advice to anyone who generally cares, like they'd like their kids to be able to jump in the local river without getting poisoned. They'd like to have fresh fish that doesn't have, mercury in it. What would you suggest to anyone who is just living their lives, but in general would be supportive of telling the government or being a part of conservation? How can just someone normally who's not a big landowner, is there anything they can be doing? Or is it really just a spectator sport?
Well, government's not the solution, and getting involved with people. I mean, we need to go back to community-based conservation. I spent 3 years in Africa and learned a lot of my lessons there. If you look at conservation in Namibia and Botswana, it's working. And it's working because of private landowners. They've restored species, they're restoring the ecosystems. And fortunately, I mean, 71% of the United States is still privately owned. That's going to be the key to the future. And rather than environmentalists attacking ranchers, attacking forest owners, attacking people who manage their land, we need to shift the debate culturally to rewarding and supporting landowners. I mean, the United States is the breadbasket for feeding the world. And with 9 billion people and 2 billion below the poverty line, our farms and ranches are critical to not only the United States but the rest of the world.
Yeah, no, it's one of the major things I've done. A lot of I've had a couple of guests on who are from China, and one of the funny things, I think the big misapprehension most Americans have is because China appears they're first, 1.1 billion people, and it appears big on a map. Most Americans have no idea that they are wildly dependent upon food imports. The Chinese cannot grow enough food on their own, right? So when you finally realize that, a lot of the kind of Western paranoia about the great communist evil, which I believe it is, right? But they're also trying to solve a real problem. They can't grow enough food on their own land. So a lot of their actions in the world are the same as the Japanese or the Singaporeans. Like, you need to import food. Um, and
Food and oil and gas
food and oil and
and
gas,
coal.
yeah, all that, right? In South Korea, I do a lot of work there. 97% of their energy has to be imported. Well,
Correct.
you got the lunatic in Pyongyang on your northern border, and his best pal is China, and that's who you're getting a lot of your fuel from. They're in a very delicate geopolitical position. Whereas in the US, we're blessed. Fortress America. Well, that proved to be not correct always, but
US today is 13.3 billion gallons. I mean, we're the largest producer in the world today. I mean, contrast that when I started my career in Washington in car lines in 1973.
And let's remember that.
You've got
My father changing the license plates on the cars because odd license plates and even license plates could fill up on alternate days.
but look at that, and here you have both the Obama and Biden administration trying to shut down the oil and gas industry through regulations. I mean, just 40, 50, 60 regulatory impacts.
And even more pernicious, right? Because all the folks I work on Wall Street, even more pernicious is they went to the banks and basically threatened them politically. Like, well, if you lend to oil and gas companies, my gosh, I think you're going to need a quadruple difficult audit from the SEC this year, right? And all of this nonsense part of what I'm wondering, and I can't get inside the head of the Democrats, they won't let me in. I don't have a visa. I don't know what they think the end goal here is. That's what I find so baffling with all this magical babble about the climate. Like, what's the end goal for you? That
Prison.
gas is $40 a gallon and only the rich can drive city to city? Why? Why is that so great?
Well, what nation has lowered its CO2 the most in the last 10 years? United States, because of gas as a major fuel. I mean, again, this whole conversation and initiative by the environmental and democratic administrations is leading to a pretzel hold. I mean, look at United Kingdom and Germany today. I mean, are destroying their manufacturing base.
Yes, madness. More coal is burnt, coal and firewood are burned in Germany today than per capita than during the Middle Ages, because after Fukushima, which is on the coast in Asia, had a tsunami hit it, Merkel took the opportunity in Germany to ban nuclear power.
Correct.
No reason, literally no reason whatsoever, which jacked electricity prices through the roof, weakened the grid, and people couldn't rely upon electricity to heat their homes anymore, so they went back to burning coal. You just can't make it up. It's so stupid.
Yeah, watch what happens this winter. I mean, this winter is going to be very tough in Europe.
Amos, thank you so much. I would love to repeat this and pick something else, another aspect to talk about, but I'm respectful of my listeners who tend to nod off after 45 minutes, no matter how fascinating our guest is. So thanks for taking the time. And I'll put the links down below to LandCAN, sorry, LandCAN or LandCAN?
LandCAN.
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 And hopefully they will pay some attention to it. I very much appreciate you taking the time. And take care. To my regular listeners, please turn off the mainstream media who are lying to you and tune into Messy Times.